Thank you, Rob. It's amazing to be here. September 3rd was a date way in the future for a long, long time that maybe might come and the book might come out, and here we are. And I want to thank you for hosting this. I want to thank you all for coming. Often when I speak, I start by apologizing for the long introduction with my bio, and I say, you know, you could have dispensed with the long bio. The long bio on our website is really only intended for my mother, and she's not here. But she is here today, so thanks for reading the full bio. And there are a bunch of people who need thanks, and I'll get to you later, but I do want to say from the outset that it is fantastic. My parents are here, my wife is here, one of my boys is here, wearing his favorite tie. You look very good, Jojo. Thank you for coming. With Hezbollah fighting alongside the Assad regime in Syria, and with people wondering how and whether Hezbollah might be part of any retaliation if there is, in fact, a strike on Syria over the use of chemical weapons. With the EU's designation, finally, the designation of Hezbollah's military wing as a terrorist group within the European Union, there's plenty to talk about Hezbollah in the here and now, and we'll circle back to that in a few minutes. But for the sake of context, let's start at the beginning. And one reason I wrote this book is because of the lack of context that has been out there. There's so little publicly available in any credible fashion about the history of Hezbollah's covert activities, the history of its activities outside of Lebanon. If you looked at the literature review, and before I started into this I did, there's lots of good stuff on Hezbollah, some not so good too. But there's lots of good literature on Hezbollah, and almost all of it is about Hezbollah as a political actor in Lebanon, and it is a political actor in Lebanon. Or about Hezbollah as a social welfare provider in Lebanon, and it is a social welfare provider in Lebanon. Or about Hezbollah's militia activities in Lebanon, targeting Israel, crossing the blue line, and of course, it's that too. But Hezbollah is also a global terrorist group, and increasingly over the years it has developed into an international organized criminal syndicate. And if you really want to understand what Hezbollah is all about, you have to understand that too, and that was missing from the literature. In fact, Hezbollah has multiple identities. It's a political party, it's social welfare, militia, it's all of that, but it's other things. It's Lebanese, it's pan-Shia, it's pro-Iranian, it's committed all at once to the decrees of Iranian clerics, to the Lebanese state, its sectarian Shia community, to fellow Shia abroad. And all these different things can sometimes pull so that you find that Hezbollah is sometimes operating along multiple identities, multiple strands that sometimes are mutually exclusive. Consider, for example, as I'm sure we will during the Q&A, how and why it might be that Hezbollah, which was already under so much pressure in Lebanon, which was already under pressure because two of its senior people and two other not-so-senior people were indicted for the assassination of Rafi Hariri by the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague, how Hezbollah could decide in its calculus that it would be a wise move to side with Iran on behalf of the Assad regime, which was butchering its own people. A group that described itself as a resistance against Israeli occupation, suddenly fighting not south, but east, not Israelis, but Syrians, not Jews, but fellow Muslims. This actually has real implications not only for the public discourse, but also for the discourse I find within government circles. Back when I was still at the tail end of finishing my book on Hamas, I was invited to a U.S. government conference, unclassified, but for current and former government analysts only here in Washington on Lebanon and Hezbollah. It was co-sponsored by two different parts of the U.S. government, and each panel was chaired by someone from the U.S. government. And on almost every panel, there was at least someone, usually someone brought in from Lebanon, but at least someone who said something like, look, I know you Americans and Israelis say Hezbollah's done all these terrible terrorist attacks abroad, but we all know it's not true. We all know it's only Al-Qaeda, so come on already. And I wasn't so surprised that someone might say that, but I was surprised that the U.S. government moderators didn't say boo, didn't challenge the statement, didn't say, well, that's your perspective, but here's another. My favorite was when one person from Lebanon said, look, I know you Americans and Israelis believe that there's some guy out there named Imad Mughniya, who's supposedly the arch-terrorist for Hezbollah, but I, said this academic from Lebanon, I went and I got an audience with Hassan Nasrallah himself, with the Secretary General of the Party of God himself, and I asked him, does Mughniya exist? And he assures me that Mughniya does not. I'm not a very nice person, so in February 2008, when Mughniya was assassinated, I penned an email to this person which was very succinct. It just said, and now we're both right. He did exist, and now he doesn't. But I didn't send it. But now that we're on C-SPAN, that person knows that I wrote it. And so after this conference, I started talking to people, not just Lebanese or Israelis or Americans, Canadians or Brits, but Chileans and Romanians and Singaporeans and Filipinos and Kuwaitis. And over the course of 9 years, conducted the research that eventually became this book. If we're going to start at the beginning, we're starting 30 years ago. 30 years ago next month with the bombings in Beirut, the bombings of the U.S. Marine barracks. In fact, it was over an 18-month period that Hezbollah carried out a series of attacks targeting Western interests, first in Lebanon and then later Western interests in the region, in the Middle East, in particular in Kuwait, and then later in the West, first in Europe and then eventually in the Western Hemisphere, in South America, in particular the 1992 and 1994 bombings of the Israeli embassy and the Ami Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, respectively. When it comes to the Beirut bombings, much of what was relevant then is relevant now. We now understand that both Imad Mughniya and his brother-in-law, Mustafa Badruddin, who has succeeded him as the head of Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization, its international strike wing, not only planned the Marine barracks bombings themselves, but watched the bombing unfold from a nearby rooftop, and then as the pressure built up in Lebanon, fled to Iran. It was there, according to New Zealand officials that I spoke to, that the IRGC helped them formalize and found the Islamic Jihad organization, the covert operations wing of Hezbollah, which itself was formed by Iranian agents as an umbrella group under which a variety of militant Lebanese extremist Shia groups were coalescing at the time in the early 1980s. We now know, only in retrospect, that the United States had intercepted a communication on September 26, 1983, weeks before the bombing, from Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security in Tehran to the Iranian ambassador in Damascus, telling the ambassador to contact a senior Shia militant tied to Hezbollah, later one of the leaders of Hezbollah, and to direct him to, quote, take spectacular action against the U.S. Marines, end quote. In the words of the commander of the Marines unit in Beirut at the time, and I quote, if there was ever a 24-karat gold document, this was it. U.S. intelligence caught Iranian officials instructing a Hezbollah leader to carry out an attack targeting the U.S. Marines in Lebanon, but the information didn't make its way through the bureaucracy until October 25th, 2 days after the bombing. Fast forward to today, by the way, we were just talking about all the news that's been happening over the long weekend. Der Spiegel is reporting that German intelligence has intercepted a call between a senior Hezbollah official and an Iranian official talking about how Assad was in fact behind last month's chemical weapons attack. By the spring of 1985, the CIA penned a Finnish intelligence report about terrorism in Lebanon entitled, and Rob would never let me get away with a title like this, Wild, Wild West Beirut. And while the State Department was writing about what it described as spillover of the Middle Eastern terrorist activities into Europe by Hezbollah and other terrorist groups, you had kidnappings, you had hijackings, you had activities throughout the region, 7 bombings in Kuwait in 1983, which led to the arrest of Badruddin, which then in turn led to the a long series of Hezbollah attacks around the world to secure the release of Mustafa Badruddin. The May 1985 attempted assassination of the Kuwaiti emir in Kuwait. Again, fast forward, many of the same groups, Hezbollah's Islamic Jihad organization, Iraq's Badr organization, even some of the exact same people would team up again 25 years later at Iran's behest to target coalition forces in Iraq. Things really began to pick up pace in Europe with the hijacking of TW-847 and the tragic assassination of Robert Stetham. Muhammad Ali Hamadi, who was one of the key hijackers and was wanted for the TWA-847 hijacking, was later arrested in 1987 at a Frankfurt airport, ferrying explosives to Hezbollah operatives elsewhere in Europe, in particular to Paris. You may recall the series of bombings that practically brought Paris to a standstill in 1985 and 1986. His compatriot, Hassan Izzaldin, was later linked to the 1988 hijacking of the Kuwait Air Flight 422 from Bangkok as part of Hezbollah's activities targeting Gulf states at the time. And then you had other operations in Europe. One, for example, involved Bassam Maki in 1989. German intelligence intercepted his communications to his Hezbollah handlers back home, but couldn't quite figure out what he was talking about. Lots of references to buying BMWs, buying Mercedes, different types of Mercedes, different types of BMWs. Eventually, they got a court-ordered raid of his apartment and found his code book. BMWs were referencing Israeli or Jewish targets. Mercedes were referencing American targets. He was arrested, served his time, and eventually deported. But that wasn't the end of Bassem Maki. He turns up several years later here in the Western Hemisphere, doing things in South America, and then there's a case involving him here in Washington, and it's an amazing story. I'll spare it all, not only because we don't have the time, but because it's really, really fantastic, and I want you to buy the book. The ties to the United States, by the way, is a theme that comes up time and time again, not only in the 2 chapters in the book that discuss the United States, but throughout. So, for example, while many people are very aware of the 1992 and 1994 bombings in Buenos Aires, you probably are not aware that when they were making phone calls home, sometimes they called directly from payphones to Hezbollah headquarters in Lebanon. Sometimes they used what they thought was a secure cutout at the Iranian embassy, which the Argentinians had penetrated. And sometimes they had their calls routed to Lebanon through Hezbollah sympathizers or supporters in New York. Perhaps you knew that the Barakat clan, since designated by Treasury, and I want to thank, by the way, my Treasury colleagues, my FBI colleagues who are here today taking the time to be with us. The Barakat clans were designated by Treasury, and you were probably aware of that. You may not be aware that until his designation, Barakat was making regular trips to Miami, Florida, with a long-term U.S. visa on his passport. Over the course of the research project that ultimately led to this book, I stumbled across some absolutely amazing stories about Hezbollah's worldwide exploits. From code words to false documents, counterfeit currency, from horrific terrorist attacks to hapless assignments with ridiculous consequences, the story has it all, and unbelievably, it's true. Consider, for example, the surreal scene where the hijacked crew of TWA 847 is bouncing back and forth across the Middle East, and they land in Algiers, and the terrorists demand that the plane be replaned, and as they're leaning out the window of the cockpit, the guy who's got the fuel, about to refuel, refuses to refuel until one of the stewardesses produces her credit card and pays for the $5,000 to $6,000 worth of gas on her personal credit card. They tried to do it again, by the way, when they came back to Algiers, and they just flat refused, and they got refueled anyway. Consider that just weeks before the successful bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in 1994, Hezbollah came just this close to blowing up the Israeli embassy in Bangkok. A long operation that had been carefully and meticulously planned and plotted over time, and what thwarted it wasn't intelligence, it was luck. It was simply the fact that the driver of the explosive-laden truck got into a fender bender with one of those three-wheeled taxis in downtown Thailand in the middle of rush hour and fled the scene. And it wasn't until they opened the truck after they had towed it to the lot, not knowing it was filled with very, very potent explosives, and they opened the doors and were overcome by the stench that they realized something was wrong. And when they opened the vats that were secured to the inside of this van, they found explosives, and underneath, buried in the vat under the explosives, was the driver who had come with the truck. It appears that the Hezbollah operatives didn't have driver's licenses or real IDs, but they found some mom-and-pop rental agency who would rent them a truck so long as they used their driver. And the dead driver's body was found in the bottom of this vat. Consider the hijacking of an airliner in Africa, an Air Afrique hijacking, where the Hezbollah operative traveled on 3 different airplanes to get finally to the airplane that he wanted to hijack, which was heading to Europe. And he managed to, decades before 9/11, smuggle his explosives on the airplane through some not terribly sophisticated means. In the first airplane, he got on and just put his explosives and his guns in a box of pastries. On the next flight, he stuck them into what I have to assume was a very smelly gym bag. And on the last plane, he ran out of creative opportunities and just bribed someone at the airport to get his explosives on the plane. But I think my favorite is in this end of the Southeast Asia chapter. Involves the Blue Diamond affair. You might have heard about this instance where a Thai foreign worker employed in the palace of a Saudi prince somehow got access to a safe and reportedly stuffed egg-shaped, egg-sized gems, stuffed them into the vacuum cleaner bag, left the palace, mailed the gems to himself, and fled the country. This led to a huge rupture in relations between the Saudis and the Thais for many, many years. And the Thais at one point had a big press conference where they laid out what they said were most of the gems, but they turned out to be chalk. And so the Saudis sent some people to investigate the case themselves. This happened to be at a time when Lebanese Hezbollah and Saudi Hezbollah together were on a tear assassinating Saudi diplomats around the world. Now, there's no evidence that they knew that the three people that they were about to assassinate in Thailand were in fact Saudi intelligence officers sent to investigate the missing blue diamond, which, if it exists, apparently is larger than the Hope diamond and other gems, but they did. The best part of it, and you can't make this stuff up, is that the local police officer, the Thai police officer who was originally tasked to investigate the case, went rogue, wanted the gems for himself, and eventually found himself, because he murdered someone, on death row, where he became an Elvis impersonator. You can't make this stuff up. But so much of the Hezbollah history circles round and back again. In the chapter on Khobar Towers, we get into an interesting discussion about how Lebanese Hezbollah recruited Saudis, Kuwaitis, Bahrainis, Lebanese, and others at the Sayyida Zainab shrine in Damascus. And later, how some of the final operational meetings, chaired by the head of Saudi Hezbollah himself, to plan the final stages of the Khobar Towers bombing, was held at the Sayyida Zainab shrine. The shrine, of course, today is at the center of Hezbollah's justification of its presence in Syria, which it claims in large part it's doing just to protect Shia, to protect ethnic Lebanese, and to protect Shia shrines. In fact, Hezbollah has a long, in fact, operational history with the shrine as well. And if we move more recently, we now have a situation, perhaps because of sanctions on Iran, perhaps because of the fall of the rial and at one point the fall of the price of oil. Hezbollah is moving out into criminal enterprises even more than it ever had before, and it has always been involved in criminal enterprises, now moving narcotics from South America across the 10th parallel, what law enforcement describes as Highway 10, to West Africa, and then laundering the proceeds of these drugs, in some cases back through the United States through used car dealerships, back to Africa, and then to Lebanon. There are so many ways that the connections come back home. As I mentioned, in February 2008, Imad Mughniya was assassinated in Damascus. At the time, by the way, both Hezbollah and Iran believed that the Syrians had assassinated him. But that's a whole long story we get into in the book. But right afterwards, Nasrallah himself announces, fine, Israel, this is how you want it, let it be open war. And it wasn't very long before that the Israelis had to wait before there was the first of a series of Hezbollah operations aimed specifically at avenging the death of Imad Mughniya. And this had to be, as Nasrallah told a Kuwaiti television station, a significant Israeli personality, a senior current or former Israeli official. This has nothing to do with assassinating Israeli tourists around the world. We'll get to that in a minute. And the first plot was in Baku, Azerbaijan. Those individuals, two of them, two Hezbollah operatives, were captured, they were tried, they were convicted under Iranian pressure, they were pretty quickly released, and they're now back home. One of them was Ali Karaki. At the very same time that Ali Karaki was arrested, on trial, and convicted for this plot in Baku, his brother Hassan, who's known as Mr. Lebanon because he won't leave Lebanon, was at the very epicenter of a massive criminal enterprise here in the United States, in the Philadelphia area, that started with knockoff goods and stolen cell phones and PlayStations. By the way, it's always, I don't know why, but every case I've seen with Hezbollah, it's knockoff or stolen PlayStations. That's why, Jojo, that's why you have a Wii. And moved from these stolen goods and stolen cars and phones to weapons procurement and much more. At the same time that one brother was involved in this plot in Baku, the other brother is involved in what became an extremely effective FBI sting operation, not only here in the United States, but abroad, with FBI sending cooperating witnesses and others to Beirut, and where they were told in private about the satellites, the Iranian satellites that Hezbollah gets access to for its targeting of Israeli cities with its rockets, a lecture they got on the nature and the number of hours a day of the counterfeit machinery that produces counterfeit currency around the world. And at the very same time, these two things are going on. There were multiple plots. One of them was in Turkey, One of the plots in Turkey involved a Kuwaiti and a Canadian citizen. That circles around today because now we know that the bombing in Burgas, Bulgaria, involved at least two dual nationals, one a Lebanese-Australian, one a Lebanese-Canadian. And again, it comes back to the United States because we now know that the Lebanese-Canadian who was involved in the Burgas plot, his father came up on the FBI and Canadian wiretaps related to the Hezbollah cigarette smuggling cell that was investigated and convicted in Charlotte, North Carolina. It all comes together as you start digging deeper and deeper and deeper. Hezbollah continues today to try to avenge the death of Imad Mughniyeh. But there's something else going on, as I mentioned. Hezbollah now is deeply involved, as we saw in Baku, in assassinating Israeli tourists around the world. Nasrallah himself told this Kuwaiti reporter that has nothing to do with Mughniyeh. If we want to assassinate an Israeli tourist here or there, that we can do at any time, he said. It has everything to do with Hezbollah's place and Hezbollah's role in Iran's shadow war with the West over Iran's nuclear program. And we get into this in some detail at the end of the book. But I think that that's an important thematic thing to pinpoint, because as we try, and I'm sure we will in the Q&A, to think about why Hezbollah is doing what it's doing in Syria, I think there are two things that people need to realize. One is the U.S. intelligence community, the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, both have said publicly, the U.S. intelligence community assesses that the Iranian-Hezbollah relationship is a strategic partnership, with Iran as the primary partner. And so it goes a long way if Iran says, we need you to do this. Not because they fund Hezbollah and Hezbollah has to do what they say because that's where they get the money. Not because that's where they get the training. There's that too, but because there is a deep ideological commitment. The quote in the book where I think it's Nasrallah, forgive me if I'm remembering if it's Naim Qassem or someone else, but one of the senior Hezbollah officials says, if you don't appreciate our sincere commitment to the concept of waliyat al-faqih, the rule of the jurisprudent, then you don't understand who we are. Now, I don't believe that everything Iran says, they say, jump and they say how high, but you have to understand and appreciate this relationship to understand what's going on. But another reason they're doing what they're doing in Syria, I think, comes down to another case here in the United States, also in the Philadelphia area, where Danny Tariff, a dual Lebanese-German citizen with an import-export company called Power Express that was operating out of Slovakia, which the FBI has described as being a total front for Hezbollah procurement, when he tried to get first M4s and then man-pads, shoulder-fire missiles, to, as he described it, take down F-16s, he was very nonchalant about how he'd get them to Hezbollah. And after prodding and prodding, he finally tells the source, don't worry, we have Latakia. We'll mark it as spare parts, to be sure. But the port of Latakia in Syria is ours. There are no inspections there. And so I think another reason Hezbollah is all in Syria is because it wants Assad to be able to stay in power. Short of that, it wants to be able to continue to have access to Damascus International Airport. Short of that, it wants to make sure that the Alawi traditional areas, including Latakia, remain in Alawi hands so that Hezbollah can continue to get reshipment, resupply from Iran and through its own procurement channels that way. But perhaps the scariest thing that we found so far wasn't in some ways the successful bombing in Burgas, Bulgaria. Of course, I don't mean to minimize that because that was a successful attack. 6 people were killed, many more injured. But where we learned even more intelligence and information, it's not intelligence, it's law enforcement, it's all open source, you can find it yourselves, was from the case in Cyprus just a week and a half earlier, where Hussam Yaqub was arrested, tried, and ultimately convicted for his crimes there, helping to put together an almost identical plot in Cyprus to what happened a couple of weeks later in Bulgaria. He first said that he knew nothing about Hezbollah. He first said that, well, okay, maybe I am Hezbollah, but then he said he didn't know that the reconnaissance that he was doing was for, but then he said, I knew that something was weird was going on. He speculated it was probably to bring down a plane, but I don't know, I'm just making assumptions. But later he said, and I quote, I was just collecting information about the Jews. And this is what my organization is doing everywhere in the world. As if to say, what's the big deal? This isn't exactly terrorism. It's just doing things against the Jews all over the world. By the way, this is all at the time when the European Union is debating whether or not to designate all or part of Hezbollah as a terrorist group. Here you are with an attack in Burgas, Bulgaria, which is part of the EU, an attempted plot in Cyprus, which was foiled but happened at a time when Cyprus held the rotating presidency of the EU. And we then found out that before Hezbollah dispatched him to Cyprus on multiple missions, first to create a credible cover story and then to carry out his reconnaissance, they first sent him to other places as a courier to deliver or receive packages for Hezbollah operatives in places like Turkey, the Netherlands, and France. These aren't the only cases, by the way. You may be aware there are current cases going on in Thailand, in Nigeria, where Hezbollah operatives have been captured and are actually going to be on trial, which is rare. It's unique. Let me end with one of my other favorite stories from the book, and I'm going to highlight it for my Treasury colleagues. Most of you have heard me tell you about this already, but as a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, this particular story is near and dear to my heart. As part of these penetrations that the FBI managed to carry out in the Philadelphia area, or from the Philadelphia area, it went globally to Africa and Europe and into the Dahia and Beirut. One of the cases involved the sale of counterfeit money. And the individual was invited to go to Beirut and to meet people, and if he passed the test, then we can do some real good business here with some counterfeit money, super notes, foreign currency, whatever you want. When the person came back to the United States, he received a photo album in the mail, as Hezbollah told him he would, with pictures of him touring around tourist sites in the Beirut area. And as instructed, he ripped off the cover of the album and looked at two examples of what Hezbollah said were its best counterfeit. You won't be able to tell the difference, they said. Unfortunately, the individual was a source working for the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So they brought it to the Secret Service and the JTTF, and the Secret Service came back and said, well, we have good news and we have bad news, and they're one and the same. This is not counterfeit. This is real money. And so they tracked the serial numbers and discovered that it was real money that you and I as taxpayers paid, that was U.S. reconstruction money sent to Iraq. So now they have our attention. Hezbollah is passing off as counterfeit real $100 bills that you and I sent to Iraq for reconstruction. And so the source is instructed to go back, and the source, by the way, is posing as a foot soldier for the Philadelphia crime world, and I'm convinced that Hezbollah just has watched way too many episodes of The Sopranos, because hook, line, and sinker, from renting a McMansion in Miami and taking them to the whole thing. The source is told to go back and tell them, look, you think we don't know in the mafia, you know, bada bing, bada bang, we don't know good counterfeit from bad? We do. We know good counterfeit from bad. The guy flushes and he says, well, I'll tell you the story. We have a problem. I don't know if you're aware, but in February 2008, somebody assassinated Imad Mughniyeh. Imad Mughniyeh. The Fox was his nickname. The man who never sleeps was his nickname. At least 3 different times we came very close to nabbing him and failed. Saudi Arabia, France, you can read about it in the book. How did they find Mughniyeh? And so Hezbollah is doing an after-action assessment. And one of their assessments is that maybe there was a penetration with Mughniyeh's terrorist slush fund. I'm not talking a slush fund for political parties. I'm not talking about a slush fund for social welfare, orphans, and widows. Apparently, Hezbollah explains to the source, Hezbollah has for years had an ongoing operation where operatives, whenever they could, stole legitimate money around the world. They got onto a tangent. One time we stole $2 million worth of Swedish krona, but the bus didn't go well, and it got stained with the purple dye pack. Do you have a solvent you can give us to literally launder the money and take the purple dye out of the bills? The money goes to Iran, it sits quietly for a while, and then is sent through Syria, through Turkey to Lebanon. And this is, to quote the Hezbollah guy, terrorism, Hezbollah terrorism. Wanted to make sure that he understood this is the real deal. This was Mughniyeh's operational slush fund. And maybe, he said, we know you guys are following the money. Maybe they followed the money. Maybe we did. I want to thank a whole bunch of people, and I want to do it very, very quickly because we have a real treat, and I'm tremendously honored to have Fred Hoff here to give some comments on the book. But I want to thank, she couldn't be here, she's in Rome, Robbie Harry, my agent, and Ron Goldfarb, who is here, who represent me, Jason Warshoff, who made this book readable, and thank you very much as an outside editor, did a fantastic job. I've published 3 books now, and this is not a shot at any of the other presses. They were lovely. but I have never had as fantastic an experience as I've had publishing this book with Georgetown University Press. If anybody out there is thinking about writing a serious book, do it with Georgetown University Press. And I want to thank Don Jacobs, acquisitions editor in particular, and everyone from the team up and down the chain. It has been and continues to be a pleasure. I've been in and out of government, as Rob said, full-time employee, part-time employee. I guess that means I can't hold down a job. But every time I've left government, I've come back to the Washington Institute, which I consider to be my intellectual home. It is an absolutely remarkable, remarkable place where we debate and we argue. We do a lot of arguing. And this book in particular is a better product for all those discussions and debates in the hallways and in the offices. And I am a very, very lucky person to be a part of the intellectual community that is the Washington Institute. Again, I want to thank you all for taking the time for coming to join us for this book launch today. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, it's a great honor for me to be invited to say a few words in connection with the release of this very important new book. I had an advance copy to glance at over the past several days, and I must say that it is a fascinating story written with strikingly vivid prose. It's a book whose intellectual foundations, I am sure, will satisfy the specialists, but whose storytelling skills will definitely appeal to a more general readership. So Matt, congratulations on a wonderful achievement that took many years of hard research and skillful writing to bring about. Matt Levitt's book is the first of its kind to focus specifically on Hezbollah's worldwide clandestine activities, which are largely criminal and terroristic in nature. One of the real services rendered by this work is the spike it drives into the notion that there is somehow a distinction between Hezbollah's military and political wings, a concept that's clung to by various academicians, politicians, and commentators, despite denials, categorical denials, by senior Hezbollah leaders themselves. It's true that the organization provides social services to its constituents. It's true that Hezbollah acts in areas where it dominates as a state within a jurisdiction, namely Lebanon, that itself is barely a state, if at all. Yet Matt Levitt accurately and eloquently described the truth of the matter as follows, quote, Hezbollah should be judged by the totality of its actions. It cannot be forgiven its criminal, terrorist, or militant pursuits simply because at the same time it also engages in political or humanitarian ones. Hezbollah's leaders often insist the group does not maintain support networks around the world, let alone carry out attacks abroad. But as the schemes and plots documented here demonstrate, Hezbollah can and has mobilized operatives for everything from criminal enterprises to terrorist attacks well beyond Lebanon's borders, unquote. Now, my own interest in Hezbollah over the past 30 years, I'm sorry to say, has focused largely on its role in Lebanon and the immediate neighborhood. In April 1983, it blew up the American embassy in Beirut, killing and injuring a great many Lebanese embassy employees who I had gotten to know well during a tour of duty at the embassy that had ended a year before. Several American officials were also killed. In October of the same year, Hezbollah attacked the U.S. Marine Corps compound adjacent to Beirut's airport, killing 241 American servicemen. A simultaneous attack targeted French peacekeepers, also with deadly results. At the time, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, created a commission of inquiry headed by retired Admiral Robert Long to investigate the airport bombing and develop a body of recommendations. As an Army major, I served on that commission. Rob, I must correct one piece of your very generous introduction. I was not the author of the Long Commission report. I wrote a chapter and contributed to several others, but the author of that report was a truly great American, Admiral Robert Long. Subsequently, Hezbollah engaged in a campaign of murder and hostage-taking aimed at Americans and other Westerners in Lebanon. A friend of mine, Marine Colonel Rich Higgins, then serving as United Nations observer in Lebanon, was one of those seized. Back in 2006, I mentioned at a public gathering that I'm one of the very few people who knows the precise manner of Rich Higgins' death, and that if I were to describe it, everyone in the room would be sickened. Shortly after that appearance, a person I knew who had developed close contacts with senior Hezbollah leaders tried to persuade me, based on what he was being told, that the person responsible for many of the outrages committed in the 1980s, Imad Mughniya, was not a person well known to the party's current leadership, including Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. That effort to persuade me, and I presume others, ended abruptly in February 2008 when the killing of Mughniya in Syria produced his canonization as a martyr by his close colleague, Sayed Hassan Nasrallah. No one should have any doubt about the murderous quality of this organization's leadership cadre. Indeed, I now work for a part of the Atlantic Council named in honor of the most prominent of Hezbollah's victims, the late Rafiq Hariri. That leadership cadre has, in my view, one central mission: to safeguard, normally within Lebanon, but now on Syrian territory as well, the clerical regime in Iran. This is the primary purpose of Hezbollah's missiles and rockets: to deter an Israeli attack on Iran and to retaliate against Israel should such an attack take place. As I've noted previously, Hassan Nasrallah is not, in my view, an Iranian stooge or employee. He is a true believer. Although he will certainly yield to the desires of Iran's supreme leader, as I suspect he did when he deployed thousands of his fighters to Syria in an effort to save Assad family rule, he is, I think, someone highly regarded by the powers that be in Iran, someone whose views are accorded respect and weight. In the end, though, he has hijacked Lebanon and a significant portion of one of Lebanon's key communities for purposes that are not Lebanese. By placing a major part of his militia at the disposal of the Assad regime, Nasrallah has rejected the disassociation policy of the government in which his party is a key member, and as such has all but seceded from the Lebanese state, such as it is. Hezbollah is now assisting the Assad regime in consolidating an area west of a line running from Jordan to Turkey, one incorporating key cities and Mediterranean Sea frontage, one contiguous in part with the Hezbollah-dominated Bekaa Valley of Lebanon. Although, in my view, we're not likely to see a formal redrawing of boundaries, what we may be witnessing is the emergence of a de facto state from parts of eastern Lebanon and western Syria, one in which the venal and incompetent Assad family may gradually give way to those who need Syria as a logistical bridge to Lebanon. Obviously, Syria is now completely dominating the headlines in this country. Our purpose today, however, is to mark the publication of a marvelous new book about Hezbollah. I'll conclude, however, by noting that Iran's decision to deploy Hezbollah fighters to Syria carries with it great risk. Hezbollah's Lebanon-based deterrent and retaliatory capability represents an important strategic asset for Iran. Saving the Assad regime, at least in a useful part of Syria, is of vital importance to Tehran. Yet, in committing Hezbollah to a fight that has, because of the Assad regime's tactics, become disturbingly sectarian in nature, Iran has risked undermining the modicum of Lebanese stability required to secure that strategic asset in the south of Lebanon. This is why it's critical for Iran and Hezbollah to win outright in Syria, at least in a part of the country that counts. This is why they are determined to win a military victory, regardless of whether or not the U.S. administration believes that a military victory is to be had by anyone in Syria. This is why Iran, at least for as long as the nuclear issue and the potential of an Israeli attack remain outstanding, has no real interest in facilitating the political transition objectives of the June 2012 Geneva Agreement. So, as we celebrate today the publication of a very significant book detailing the scope and implications of Hezbollah's global reach, let us also remember that Iran and its Lebanese militia are all in, trying to bind the people of Syria to Iran's strategic objectives in Lebanon and in the region. From the point of view of the Supreme Leader and his colleagues, keeping the organization in business, whose international depredations have been so skillfully chronicled and described by Matt Levitt, is an objective of supreme importance. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Fred. Very important statement. And Matt, again, congratulations to you. I'd like to open a question-and-answer session with, I think, the topical question, which is probably on the minds of about 100 of people in the room, which is, given everything that we know about the last 30 years of Hezbollah action and Hezbollah's relations with Iran and Syria, so what does Hezbollah do if and when America strikes Syria? Why don't we go up and why don't we use the mic here?
First of all, thank you, Fred. And I want to add, forgot to thank one tremendously important group of people. That's the Washington Institute RAs and interns who slaved for years over this book. A bunch of you are here today, which gives me great pleasure. So I just want to call out Diva, Jonathan, Give, Stephanie, Julie, Sam, Nicole, or a whole bunch more, but couldn't have done it without you.
They all worked for math.
Let it go, let it go. So Hezbollah has multiple capabilities. But contrary to what some think, I don't think that either the Iranian mullahs or Hezbollah are irrational at all. I think they're quite rational. We just tend here in the West to impose our Western sense of rationality on them. We tend to be very risk averse. They tend to be not so much, and rather aggressive. In the event that there is a strike, if that strike is perceived as being, and is limited, is perceived as being a punishment for use of chemical weapons, which the Iranians are probably not very happy about. They have their own history suffering significant losses from chemical weapons. This is quite uncomfortable for them that their close ally has used chemical weapons. Hezbollah has in fact said that if the strike is limited, then their response would be limited. But if it's more, then the inferno will open type of thing. There are lots of rhetoric. If there is a strike that is seen as significantly undermining the continued viability of the Assad regime, I completely agree with Fred. Iran and Hezbollah are all in. All in. I think that they would use some of their capabilities. That not only includes the ability to rain rockets down in Israel, and not only northern Israel, Hezbollah has restocked and resupplied many more rockets, longer range rockets. Rockets, even those that are north of the Litani River, can still go farther south than the rockets could go back in '06. But also, of course, the kind of global terrorist infrastructure that we have been discussing today is available to it. The question really is, on top of the two terrorist operational streams that we already discussed, avenging the death of Imad Mughniya by assassinating current or former senior Israeli officials, being part of Iran's shadow war with the West by targeting Israeli tourists and incurring a cost to Israel of what it's doing to frustrate Iran's nuclear program, will there now be a third leg to that stool where they will be instructed to do things also because of Syria. Now, if they already have these two different sets of operations going on, they're already trying to do things, does it really make that much of a difference if there's yet a third reason to do things? I don't think it necessarily means that they will have more capabilities. Perhaps they would send more people, but at the end of the day, the world is a more complicated place for terrorists to operate today than it was pre-9/11. We still have to stop all plots, and they just need to succeed once. And so the odds are in their favor, but it's not a given that they will necessarily succeed. I mean, the final chapter of the book documents both Hezbollah and Iranian IRGC Quds Force, plots that were not foiled or thwarted, but failed because they were like the keystone cops of terrorists today. So it's also worth noting that while Hezbollah has capabilities and is a reason why it's a high-tier threat, it's also not 10 feet tall. At the end of the day, Hezbollah doesn't need much of an excuse to target Israel. I think that if there are rockets targeting Syria, there will probably be at least some rockets targeting Israel, but they'll be limited because at the end of the day, Hezbollah and Iran and the Assad regime all do not want to invite the Israeli Air Force into this battle, and they do not want to unite the West, which is clearly not united right now, in a decision to do more targeting the Syrian regime.
Thanks, Rob. Very, very briefly, it's an excellent question. Obviously, what will Hezbollah do? I think to some extent it depends on what is done. Actually, I think if it's a pinprick operation, if it's a shot across the bow, Hezbollah will do exactly what the Assad regime will do in that case. It will signal its contempt for the United States of America and drive on in Syria as if nothing has happened. I think, though, if I were actually back in government and actually responsible for some of these things, as opposed to just talking about them, I would plan for the absolute worst. No doubt, as the time draws close to when the United States is going to be doing something kinetically in Syria, there will be perhaps a series of embassy drawdowns and restrictions. There will be a series of travel warnings for American tourists and business travelers. I think it's inescapable that we plan for the worst. I'm inclined, though, to agree with Matt. I think the one thing Nasrallah is able to do, the one lesson he learned from his almost fatal experience in 2006 is keep your eye on the ball. He's going to take this into account as he gauges how to react to whatever it is the United States does. His central mission is to maintain the integrity of that strategic deterrence and retaliatory capability in southern Lebanon. So whatever he decides to do, he's going to have to weigh the pros and cons of putting that at risk if he gets caught red-handed, as he has several times in the past.
Okay, thank you. All right, let's open the floor to your questions. Start over here with Indira. If you could just wait for the mic to head to you, identify yourselves for our viewing public, and then pose your question.
Bob took part of my question, which is what would Hezbollah's response would be to the U.S. strikes. But further on that, we're hearing Senator McCain and others talk about bolstering the opposition and reducing the power of the Assad regime. So I want to ask both Fred and Matt what they think about the administration's supposed failure to send the weapons that were promised months ago to the Syrian opposition, and are we at the point where we can distinguish the so-called good from the bad Syrian opposition, and what would be the outcome of aiding them more at this point in conjunction with or parallel to any U.S. strikes, and how Hezbollah might react to that? Thanks.
I think Senator McCain is on to something here. I think an essential adjunct to whatever it is the United States does in the way of military strikes is to get really serious about supporting the mainstream opposition. Now, it's not as if, as some critics allege, nothing has been done. The question is one of scope, one of size. The United States does have a highly refined understanding of who it is it wishes to support in the ranks of the Syrian armed opposition. A highly refined understanding. The question is one of policy, frankly. There is a fear, an understandable fear, that some things supplied could fall into the wrong hands, namely into the hands of jihadist al-Qaeda elements who are already armed to the teeth in any event. So the question is, do you allow that fear to either stop supplying the mainstream elements or really restrict the flow? I mean, fortunately, we didn't have such a fear motivating our policy during World War II when we were airdropping weapons into occupied France. a lot of those things found themselves into the wrong hands. So I think what you're going to see as this week unfolds is the administration is going to be questioned very, very, very closely in the Senate and in the House about the totality of its strategy, its objectives and its strategy towards Syria. And I think this question of arming and otherwise supporting the opposition is going to be a key element of this.
Yeah, I agree. I'll just add that it's going to be a question of what kind of checks we can have in place. Don't mean to make a pun, but the precedent, of course, was the case where the Czech weapons ended up with Jabhat al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. But there are ways to go about this and to do it in such a way that some of these individuals and groups that Fred has referenced that we do know about can get some of the material that they need. The cost to not doing that is that by default, the jihadists continue to be the best armed and therefore the best and most effective fighting force on the ground on the rebel side, and end up being invited in by the rest of the FSA and company simply because they have no other choice. So we do need to find a way to be able to do this in a way that we have some checks and balances. We can tag weapons, we can do things. We need to work closely with our allies, some of whom are not so concerned about what weapons go where, and there's more improvement we could do there too. But this has to be part of the package.
Yes, Barbara, then we'll move around. Right in the middle, please.
Thanks, Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council, and I'll monitor. Thank you both, and I look forward to reading the book. Matt, I would be interested in your assessment. You talked a little bit about the Keystone Cops aspect of some of what Hezbollah's been doing lately. With Mughniya gone now since 2008, what is your assessment of the ability of this group to conduct terrorism activities abroad, and what is your evaluation of how well they did in the recent fighting in Syria? Was it just that they were better than the Syrian soldiers and the opposition that they faced at that time? What is your estimation of the real ability of this organization after all these years to carry out terrorist attacks and to fight on the ground in Syria? Thanks.
So we say that a threat is combined intent and capability. On the intent side, Hezbollah is all set. And that makes a big difference because they're committed and they are true believers. And so when given an instruction, they will follow through. But there has been a shift over time having to do with nothing that was Hezbollah's creation, where Hezbollah started shifting away from international terrorist operations as such, more towards international illicit financial support activity, logistics, and focused more heavily on its militia, and that was 9/11. And I get into that in the book in some detail. What that meant is that Hezbollah's militia became very, very, very good. It's not just that it is the largest and best armed militia in Lebanon, larger, better armed, more disciplined, I believe, than the Lebanese armed forces. But it is very, very good. So in Syria, it especially in Qusair, made a significant difference because they are well trained in these tactics. And you have both within Hezbollah the full-time cadre and if you'll allow me, the reservists who have their weapon in the closet and come out for training every so often. And so they've proven very, very capable, especially in urban street fighting in Syria. When it comes to their international terrorist capability, so part of it is that we have to be successful every time. They only have to get through once, and so you only have to be so good. And they have had a variation. They've had some people who have seemed to be very, very capable, and other people less so. And what's more surprising is they've had some people who have been very, very capable in some ways and shown excellent operational security, and then all of a sudden not. There was one case where the individual showed great operational security for almost the entire operation, but at one point didn't pay a hotel bill and left and stiffed, like whatever it was, a $100, $200 hotel bill. And if it hadn't been for the fact that this particular low-rent establishment hadn't paid rent in a long time and didn't really want to bring that to the attention of law enforcement, they might have told law enforcement that this guy stiffed me with the bill, and they might have actually found this guy. Very poor operational security. You have it on Iran too. The best example there is not Hussein Atris, the Hezbollah operative who was arrested in Thailand, but the Iranian Quds Force operatives who were arrested just a week and a half later, who were tracked down because they were hanging out with prostitutes before they went to carry out their deed, and worse, from an operational security perspective, allowed the prostitutes to take pictures of them all hanging out together on their cell phones, which is how we found them at the airport. So on the one hand, they're not 10 feet tall, but on the other hand, Hezbollah got training in the types of intelligence, counterintelligence, operational security that make it qualitatively better in some ways in terms of these types of operations than anyone else out there. And so if Hezbollah puts it in its head that it is going to do something, then ultimately something will happen. They're patient. And eventually they will at least continue to try and do something to avenge Mughniya's death. And so long as Iran tells them to continue trying to target Israeli tourists, that will continue too. Some of those plots, by the way, have gotten a lot of play. Some of them have not, because they weren't more than surveillance. But reportedly, for example, surveillance at the airport in Johannesburg and other places. There's a lot that's been going on.
Can I ask a question that's prompted by your last comment, and this is as much to Fred as to you, Matt? Given that we're now talking every day about red lines and maintaining American commitments, how is it from the Beirut bombings through Khobar till today that Hezbollah has escaped significant American retribution?
He said this was for you too. No, I'll give you some time to think. Okay. One of the few benefits, and there aren't many, to writing a book over this long a period of time, and I must say again that in Dawn at Georgetown University Press, I had an editor who was pushed when he had to, but had the patience of Job overall, is that you are able to go and talk to people and talk to them again and re-interview and beg and beg and beg and beg and beg some more for documentation. And I was able to collect a not so small collection of declassified intelligence reports, American and many, many others. And one of the things that comes out, Rob, time and again from the declassified U.S. intelligence reports is the fact that there has never been a consequence. And that this consequence has led both Iran and Hezbollah to believe that terrorism is effective. They have cited over the years the Beirut bombings, and other groups now do too, as an example of how this is effective. And eventually U.S. forces left, and et cetera. And that there was no significant response. This, as a former FBI person, I can say with confidence, was a tremendous frustration for the FBI in particular over the Covert Towers incident. And at the end of the day, all FBI had in its power to do was to make sure, with DOJ, of course, that what I like to call is, an uber indictment, a much, much more detailed indictment than you would normally have, was issued right before the statute of limitations ran out. But this has had some serious consequences. Now, why this is the case, I think part of it is because both Hezbollah and Iran, one of the reasons I see this as being so effective is not only that it seems to work, and not only that it's relatively cost-effective, these attacks don't cost all that much money, but because it's cost-effective in the sense that it doesn't incur a cost for Hezbollah and Iran both. And I think this gets back to our discussion of what might be likely forms of retribution if there is a U.S. attack in Syria. Being able to do things that are reasonably deniable, just reasonably deniable, is really important to them. It makes it more difficult for the world to have consensus. What does the intel show? What does it not show? Do we all agree on it? And then even if you agree, for example, that Hezbollah did Burgas and tried to do Cyprus, so what do you hit? It wasn't launched from a particular headquarters. It can be difficult to get consensus and agreement politically on that as well. And so I feel that they feel that buys them some level of protection.
I agree with all of that. I would say that to the extent there have been cases, or there may have been cases in the past where some kind of specific retribution may have been exacted, it's the sort of thing that we're not likely to hear anything about either now or ever. I would, and on the strategic level, when we're thinking in terms of retribution, I think from the point of view of the United States, we always have to take into account who's really on the line here. Hezbollah has an impressive array of weaponry in southern Lebanon. That weaponry, quite obviously, is not aimed at the east coast of the United States. We all know where it's aimed. We all know whose interests and equities are at stake here. So any thought the United States might give to smacking Hezbollah where it lives really has to take into account that aspect of things.
Let me just add that in agreement, it's not the case that we haven't ever done anything. So I'll direct you, for example, on the South America chapters to the discussion of Operation Double Top. And I'll direct you in the Southeast Asia chapter to Operation Pink Poppy and a whole bunch of others. There are things that haven't done.
Okay, thank you. Mike Kraft here, and then David, right over here. We'll try to get as many in as we can.
Thanks very much. First of all, Matt, I want to commend you on your detailed research and great material, especially on the section on the hostage taking in 1980, which you show in great detail for the benefit of others, that the main motives were trying to get release of prisoners, not because of American policy in the Middle East, as some people tried to put in Congress. I have a question. I'd like to lead into that when you talked about dealing with Hezbollah. Your fascinating chapter on the organization's financial and criminal activities in the United States, especially being from Detroit and seeing what my former neighbors were doing there raising money. And you go into great detail on some of these operations, including counterfeit Viagra. But I'm wondering, one of the things precipitated by the groups such as Hezbollah was the Material Support Amendment provisions that were passed by Congress in 1996 to make it illegal to provide financial or other support for terrorist groups. Do you have any assessment of whether that's had much of an impact or chilling effect? I know Justice Department has made a number of cases in this. And related to your valiant efforts to get the Europeans to crack down on Hezbollah, could you expand a little bit on the rationale for not doing so?
Okay, hold on. Dave Pollack on the right.
Thank you. And congratulations, Matt, on the book. And a quick comment and a question. The comment is about Rob's question about why hasn't the United States retaliated much against Hezbollah. There was one key case, which is Hobart Towers, in which part of the reason was the election of a new Iranian president who seemed to be a so-called moderate. And we didn't want to, I was in government at the time, but it's now a matter of public record. We didn't want to ruin, as it was put, the chances of some kind of rapprochement with Iran by striking at Hezbollah in retaliation for Hobart. I'm afraid that we may be in the process of repeating that history today with Rouhani and Iran, and I would welcome any comment that you might have about that. But my question is, back to Syria. You both said that Hezbollah is all in, along with Iran, in Syria. But what exactly does that really mean? How many thousands of Hezbollah fighters are likely to end up in Syria? How much more Iranian support for Hezbollah or Iranian pressure on Hezbollah to do that? Up to what point? And related, of course, to that is what could be done to change that calculus of Hezbollah and Iran in Syria? Thank you.
Mike Rollins up in front. Right
Congratulations, Matt. Mike Reynolds with Booz Allen, but more than that, a long-time supporter, friend, and colleague of Matt's. And to your wife and to your son and to your family, I would say, I'm sure you understand the treasure you have, but truly a great American in every sense of the word. So we've gone around the room and we've talked a little bit about what next in Syria. For law enforcement, I think the question that many have is, in terms of those red lines, like Rob mentioned, and Fred, what is their red line for bringing those attacks into the heartland of America?
Okay, why don't we take those questions, those simple questions.
All right, we'll try. A couple of them were 12-part questions. On the material support statute, we have people in this room who've been doing this for a long time in DOJ and can speak to it better than I, but this has been a huge tool. On the Hezbollah account, though, it's kind of interesting because most of the Hezbollah cases in the United States have not been material support cases. And most of the cases in which Hezbollah has been involved, since Hezbollah is so deeply involved in criminal activity, prosecutors have simply opted not to mention the H word Hezbollah, the T word terrorism, and to simply try them for whatever money laundering, fraud, cigarette smuggling, mortgage fraud, watering down baby formula, tax evasion that they were doing as a quicker and easier way to get the conviction. That has changed a little bit because there's also seen as being utility in exposing the activity. But we've had many, many different cases, and in the book I get into great detail about Operation Smokescreen, Operation Bathwater, Operation Bell Bottoms. I didn't make up the names, but they're wonderful literary tools. And so there's a lot there to discuss. In terms of the EU rationale, and this is the one area where the book is already out of date, I'm pleased to note, because when we went to press, the EU was still not actually willing to have this discussion. And in fact, I spent the time while Georgetown University Press was slaving over the manuscript, going back and forth to Europe, trying to convince them to do something. I think the rationale, it comes down to a variety of things, including some of them are concerned about retaliation, some are concerned about the impact for UNIFIL. Most of them were afraid that some were just generally uncomfortable with the idea of designating it in whole or in part as a terrorist group, something that is a duly elected political party. But the one thing that was consensus among all the Europeans was concern that if you designated Hezbollah, certainly if you designated all of Hezbollah, your influence over domestic Lebanese politics, your ability to try and prevent things from getting worse would be mitigated, and they were desperate for those channels of communication to remain open. So much so that right after the designation, a senior Hezbollah official said to the EU representative in Lebanon, there is no such thing as a distinction between the military and the political wings. So you've designated me, a politician, by designating the military wing. Do you still think I'm going to talk to you? And I think he said that to her because he understood that that was her, that was the Europeans' greatest fear. On the issue of Kobar coming right after Khatami was elected, I think, David, that's absolutely true. And we have on our website, post-book, a piece I did for the Institute on my fears that while Iranian moderates might be moderates in some ways domestically, the history, and again I pulled from the declassified U.S. intelligence reports for this, the history is quite otherwise, and the U.S. intelligence community was assessing when each of the last two presidents came in, when this was going on, that under Khatami, under Rafsanjani, the terrorism didn't switch one iota, and so that was just part of a larger political calculus. I don't know anybody who can answer outside of classified settings, and maybe even in any honest way, the question of how many to what point, and certainly outside of government. I think anybody who tries to answer that is making it up. Now, there's a lot of different reporting out there, some going as high as 10,000. I find that less likely. But there are a few thousand, certainly, 5,000 to 8,000, and of their better trained, not the reservists. But Hezbollah wants to make sure that there are people back home to protect against, what if the Israelis see this as an opportunity to do something? They also are having a really hard time politically at home. They feel they need to protect the Dahya, which has been struck now on more than one occasion, Hezbollah's stronghold in the southern suburbs. What I mean by all in is that Hezbollah has put its reputation on the line. Right? Resistance against Israel now goes through Damascus somehow. It is critical to them for the Assad regime to win. I think at the end of the day, no matter what happens, Hezbollah loses. If the Assad regime comes out completely victorious, which I find implausible, Hezbollah is still going to be deeply despised by the majority Sunni portion of the Muslim and Arab worlds for many, many years. This will not be soon forgotten. And in the more likely event that things continue as they are horribly for some time and eventually Assad is killed or leaves or escapes to Latakia or what have you, Hezbollah doesn't win, its reputation is further shot down. At home in Lebanon, its standing is severely, severely undermined. Hezbollah has a massive ideological crisis right now because the Islamic resistance is resisting fellow Muslims. Mike, who was my boss at the FBI, who therefore has to say nice things about me, I think that it's quite clear, both from declassified FBI and CIA reports that I included in the book, that, as Fred has said, we have always done the prudent thing, which is plan. And there's planning that's going on right now, to be sure. My concern is this. The one thing that was consistent, and not everything was, but the one thing that was consistent in these intelligence reports over many years, is the idea that so long as it's not seen by Hezbollah that we, the United States, are directly doing things to undermine their true core interests, that they wouldn't attack us directly. They wouldn't want to pick a fight with the 800-pound gorilla, and they wouldn't want to put their cash cow and other types of logistics they're able to do here, dual-use procurement items and all the things we've discussed, at risk. But Hezbollah and others for a long time have saying that we're behind what's happening in Syria and that we're behind the Special Tribunal for Lebanon. I think that they see that we are behind a lot of what's going on. Now, I don't think Hezbollah yet wants to pick a fight with us, but it has that potential capability out there in the long term. Even the Charlotte cigarette smuggling cell, there are pictures of them out in the woods in the Carolinas, and they weren't shooting around with little handguns. They were shooting around with fully automatic weapons or very sophisticated sniper rifles. And in Detroit, we've had at least one case, one of the only cases I know of a Hezbollah guy who was snuck across the border from Mexico, who is possibly the most dangerous Hezbollah guy ever to be in the country, so much so that the FBI arrested him at the first opportunity for some small thing just to get him off the street while they put together a big material support case and went before the judge saying, you have to deny bail. Why? Because we're afraid this guy will go assassinating people that he thinks have turned against him. The FBI testified not in open session, but in questions for the record after the case several years ago, that FBI sees Hezbollah conducting surveillance in this country, which the FBI assesses is predominantly used to vet new recruits. But that does mean that Hezbollah has that off-the-shelf potential planning, which is standard Hezbollah modus operandi. And frankly, if you never, ever, ever, under any circumstance intended to use it, there's probably a better way to train your future, check forger and tax evader and white-collar crime guy who's going to raise money for Hezbollah through, mortgage fraud than having him surveil a federal building.
David, on the question of how many fighters are in Lebanon, I've seen no truly reliable estimates, but I heard John McCain on one of the Sunday shows use the number 5,000, which I presume he gets from somewhere. We would also have to add to that Iranian-provided Iraqi militiamen who are inside Syria now in considerable numbers. How to change the calculus of these characters? I think first it's important to understand what the calculus is, and that is that indeed a military victory can be had either in Syria at large or in a part of Syria that really counts for Iran and Hezbollah. Otherwise, the risks to Hezbollah and the risk to the Iranian enterprise in Lebanon is so great that to commit Hezbollah forces to Syria for anything less is just nonsense. Okay, so I think we need to understand that despite our president's assurance that there is no such thing as a military victory by anyone in Syria. These folks don't agree with it, and in that sense, they're all in. How do you change the calculation? I think this is one of the things the President, Secretary of Defense, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs have to take into account now as they devise an operation that will be presumably authorized by the U.S. Congress. If that operation is significant enough, if at a minimum, it destroys or significantly degrades the ability of the Assad regime to bring mass terror to Syrian populations, this could change the Iranian Hezbollah calculation. They could come to the conclusion that, maybe a military victory isn't possible here. In a diplomatic sense, and I know this is kind of a Hail Mary pass, if there were an agreement between Iran and all the rest of us on the nuclear issue, I think Iran would pay a lot more attention to the prohibitively costly size of the investment it is making in Syria, okay? If the prospect of an Israeli attack or an Israeli attack joined by the United States or whatever, if that goes away, I think it's inevitable that there would be a recalculation of some kind on the part of Iran.
Trying to figure out how we translate Hail Mary pass into Arabic. We'll work on that. One sentence questions, because then we're going to have to close. Right here, please.
Thank you. It's actually a follow-up question with regard to the EU designation of the military wing. And the question is, does Hezbollah see it just as a slap on the wrist, which means nothing? They can still collect money in Europe simply by people saying they're collecting for the political wing, or is it a serious blow to them operationally?
Right next.
Right next.
Hi, Ben Barber, writing for Huffington Post. How do we hit Hezbollah and not empower Al-Qaeda?
Okay.
How do we hit Hezbollah?
EU
and not
designation,
empower
is it
Al-Qaeda?
serious? And how do we get Hezbollah without empowering Al-Qaeda?
So, if Europe was really, really intent on being able to freeze as much assets as possible, by definition, they undermine their own potential to do that by designating just part of the group, right? Because then you just raise money under the other parts of the group. But actually, there's not a great history of the EU actually seizing a whole lot of money under any of its programs, so that's really not the most important thing. The most important thing was, in the first instance, a shot across the bow indicating there's some type of cost, in this case political, to Hezbollah for conducting terrorist operations within the European Union. Hezbollah lobbied long and hard against this, and so they're very, very upset about it. There are tangible benefits, though. Most importantly, in all my travels back and forth, both with EU officials and, more importantly, with member state officials, it became very, very clear that there were a small number of European countries, the Germans in particular, who were already doing plenty to deal with Hezbollah quietly. And there were others who were saying, look, we can't because this is not a designated terrorist group, and so we don't really have the authority. It's not. This now gives them the authority. And more to the point, it gives us an opportunity now to be able to go to our counterparts and say, look, now you have this authority, and the European Union has said that this is happening, and you need to do stuff. The most important things that will happen are at the member state level. And so, when John Brennan went to Ireland and he talked about this, he said the most important thing is that they start opening up investigations, and that's absolutely the case. And I think that we're going to see that. The Israelis have already said that they intend to share a lot more information with the Europeans now that the Europeans are in a position to do something about it, and that actually creates a dynamic, because you can't then sit on the information. God forbid something happens, you didn't do anything, and someone gave it to you, that's a problem. So I actually think there are lots of ways, and we have a few things on our website actually talking about how the EU designation can be used to actually make a big difference. Dan, look, what did I say? Ben. Ben, I don't see these as if-then statements, right? It is not the case that if we punish and degrade the capabilities of the Assad regime and Hezbollah, that the beneficiary is necessarily al-Qaeda and the jihadists. As Fred said, there are elements within the opposition that we can and should work with. Part of the response to all of this has to be providing them the tools they need to get the job done. One of the part-time government employee gigs I did was as a counterterrorism advisor for the State Department relating to the Israeli-Palestinian peace process at a time when we were bringing vetted Palestinians into Jordan and training them so that they could do what had to get done. And that was tremendously successful. I'm not telling you anything that's not public from your own paper and others, that this is now being done at a smaller scale with some of the Syrians. That there is what to do. Because right now, you're right, there are bad guys on every side of this equation, but that does not need to be the case moving forward. There are good guys that we can work with in the rebel opposition, and meanwhile, we cannot allow the Assad regime to get away with gassing his own people, and you cannot allow Hezbollah to get away with crossing borders and bringing devastation to the Syrian people and dragging that devastation back home across the border to Lebanon.
Final word, Fred?
Final couple of words. I would just say that one of the real victories of the Assad regime in the information war it's been waging since March 2011, since all of this started, is its ability to get across the idea that the only alternative to our murderously corrupt activity is al-Qaeda. This is an incorrect notion that has even implanted itself in certain quarters of the United States Congress. And I think it's well worth keeping in mind that for many, many, many years, 10 to be precise, there has been a network of strong connections between the Syrian regime and al-Qaeda in Iraq, connections originally used to facilitate the movement of these characters through Syria into Iraq, connections which I strongly suspect still exist.